Media is operated by SAU 16 and can be found on Channel 8 with all your school sports, events, and meetings. You can watch Exeter TV online at exeternh.tv, Apple TV, and on Roku. Find us on social media for extra content. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell to get notified about live streams and new content. Tune in to our platforms every other Friday to watch the Exeter Biweekly Report with recaps of recent events, updates from town departments, and messages from nonprofits in your area. If you head to our website, exeternh.tv, we invite you to sign up to our newsletter to receive monthly updates about new content, upcoming meetings, and more. We'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch Exeter TV and hope that you tune in to our other content as well.
I'm Barbara Rimkunis, co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society. Tonight's program takes place in Misquamscook, now called Exeter, in Nadakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the Elnabak, the people who have stewarded Nadakina and its Aki, Nibi, Olaquakak, and Owaasak, the land, the waterways, flora, and fauna throughout the generations.
Thank you, Barbara. My name is Laura Martin. I'm the co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society, and I thank you for joining us tonight, both in person and virtually, to learn about Lucy Terry Prince, the first known African-American poet in the United States. It's the perfect program to celebrate U.S. National Poetry Month. This program is made possible by the New Hampshire Humanities. You can learn more at nhhumanities.org. I only have a few announcements. At the end of tonight's program, we ask that you take a few moments to complete the Humanities to Go survey. There will be time at the end of the program to fill out the survey. These evaluations help to ensure New Hampshire Humanities has the feedback necessary to continue to provide and support programming like this. Our May program, also sponsored by the New Hampshire Humanities, will be on Tuesday, May 7th, here and virtually. Carrie Brown will present Rosie's Mom, Forgotten Women of the First World War. We will hold our annual business meeting immediately following the program. Now, I know that business meetings are typically fascinating and difficult to resist, so we are counting on our members staying through the brief meeting so that we will have a quorum. Our reception for the Seacoast LGBTQ+ History Project exhibit at the Historical Society will be held on Friday, April 12th from 4 to 7 p.m. We hope you can join us. We'd also, in addition to the New Hampshire Humanities, like to thank Exeter TV for bringing all of our programs to our members and friends virtually. They are making it possible for us to reach a much larger audience, and we truly appreciate it. Check out our website, exeterhistory.org, for more information about our events and for more Exeter history. Tonight, if you'd like to ask a question and you're here in person, please raise your hand and wait for one of us to come to you with a microphone. This helps the speaker hear you, as well as people who might be on Zoom or Facebook. If you are on Zoom or Facebook, please put your question in the comments section and we'll try to ask it on your behalf. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Shanta Lee is a writer of poetry, creative nonfiction, journalism, and she's a visual artist and public intellectual, actively participating in the cultural discourse with work that has been widely featured. Shanta Lee is also the author of the poetry collection, Ghetto Claustrophobia, Dreamin' of Mama While Trying to Speak Woman in Woke Tongues, winner of the 2020 Diode Press Full-Length Book Prize and the 2021 Vermont Book Award. Her poetry has been nominated for many awards. Dark Goddess, an exploration of the sacred feminine, her latest exhibition, which features her short film, as well as interviews, photography, and other items, has been on view at the University of Vermont's Fleming Museum of Art. Welcome, Shanta.
Oh, you know what? I forgot my friend the clicker that's going to make this all the much more fun. Let's get that. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. So, I'm really excited to talk about Lucy Terry Prince, and also talk about witness, voice, and poetics within American tradition. Even though this is going to be a very, okay, where do I aim this thing? Let's see how this, it worked earlier when we tested it. Ah, there we go. I think I pointed up somehow. I will engage this quote by Lucille Clifton, fellow poet, writer. I come to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable, which I think is important to remember, especially as we think about creating. And the spirit of creating, whether we are penning words, whether we are holding a camera, these days a phone, whether we're painting on a canvas, what is the purpose of that work, right? And also tapping into my mentor, Emily Bernard, thinking about what does it risk us? What will it cost us to create work? And we'll see that when we look at Lucy Terry Prince's only surviving poem, or at least the only poem that we know of, Bars Fight. So here are some potential possibilities and what I kind of was thinking as I have revised this talk, and I like to keep revising work, especially based on my engagement with different audiences. There's so many ways that you could look at Bars Fight by Lucy Terry Prince by examining ballads within its historical context. Ballads were a form of poetry that was very common then, right? And some people have joked and called it like the bad news of poetry. Like, it's a way that information could travel, but also very memorable speech. You also could look at this within the context of women within this period of history. One of the things that I will forever be mentored and trained from my undergrad and looking at who's missing from history. My undergrad was women, gender, and sexuality. So thinking about the broad span of voices, outside of the main actors, right? And who or how we hear about certain things, what might be the very quiet but powerful voices in between those different spaces. And also thinking about New England, right? Like, we can think about New England history, we could think about New England poetry, we could think about the impact of place. Landscape is very fascinating, and place, whether we're conscious of it or not, the way that impacts how one writes. So I'll give you an example. I was doing an interview with Fred Jaguar, who, he has a 30-plus year just span of plays and essays and books, etc. And he talked about dialectics, like the ocean impacting verse. I just finished a piece for Poetry Foundation comparing, because my second book was about Ovid. It was a conversation with Ovid. One day we'll talk about how one talks to dead people through their work. That's another talk altogether, potentially. But in it, I talked about the imperial body, and it was looking at one of my versions of a poem, the Ovid's version and Ted Hughes' version. So there are different ways, whether we're conscious of not, whether we're writing or not, that place just impacts work. Couple of things though, like fun disclaimers. Disclaimer number 1, viewing the layers without performing dissection, being simplistic or reductionist, which sometimes is really hard, especially in a context and moment when it seems like all we want to do, right? Especially those of us who've studied, or if you've gone for a PhD, like dissection upon, that's what you become trained to do, but also trying to resist it. And this is a great quote by Susan Brine Morrow, who wrote the Pyramid Text. Writing was not simply about a thing. It contained the thing. It was the thing. This layered richness of meaning works on a level that is beyond analysis. So sometimes, obviously, she's talking very specifically about one of the original pieces of poetry, right? Things that you can't really take and say, well, we have an analysis and an understanding. No, because there's a whole other layers around it. And at the same time, sometimes a thing is just a thing as it stands on its own. It's a bit complicated at least for my brain, I'll admit, to resist analysis. So disclaimer number 2, Thunder, the Perfect Mind, which another great work, I'm gonna say is estimated around, oh God, I'm gonna get my dates all mixed up. It is really old, really old, the text. If you've not laid eyes on it, do lay eyes on it. It's very fascinating. It says here, although thunder appears to be an erotic form of expression in the 21st century, that was not the case in the ancient world, especially in the Hellenistic Mediterranean world. There were the other pieces of literature that resembled thunder. In fact, thunder seems to echo significantly parts of 2 overlapping major ancient literary traditions, a literature of divine self-representation called orality and wisdom mythology. It can also be compared to some of the limited ways to traditions of ancient Mediterranean riddles. So Thunder, the Perfect Mind, just to give you a little snapshot, I love it. I'm absolutely obsessed with it. But the voice is what we would call an omniscient narrator in this context. And you can't tell, but it's got all these beautiful juxtapositions, and you can't see who's talking. You don't know who's talking. The voice is just talking to you. And again, thinking about viewing something within the context, again, at the same time, letting the thing just stand as the thing all on its own. But also, here's my other point, is leaving room for the possibilities that go beyond even all these things, right? So as we think about bars fight, as we think about these words, and I will leave room for questions, obviously, I want to invite curiosity, but also people have raised concern, especially because of the tone of the poem. So why don't I bring the poem to you for your ears, and for all of you watching from home and watching on Zoom. Bars Fight by Lucy Terry Prince. August was 25th, 1746. The Indians did in ambush lay, some very valiant men to slay, the names of whom I'll not leave out. Samuel Allen like a hero fought, and though he was so brave and bold, his face no more shall we behold. Eleazar Hawks was killed outright, before he had a chance to fight, before he did the Indians see, was shot and killed immediately. Oliver Amson, he was slain, which brought his friends much grief and pain. Simeon Amson they found dead, not many rods distant from his head. Adonijah Jaleh, we do hear, did lose his life, which was so dear. John Sladler fled by water, and thus escaped the dreadful slaughter. Eunice Allen saw the Indians coming and hoped to save herself by running, and had not her petticoats stopped her, those awful creatures would not have caught her, nor tommyhawked her on the head, leaving her on the ground for dead. And young Samuel Allen, oh lack-a-day, he was taken to Canada. So you can hear the beat, right? You can hear the rhythm. There's something about when you invite people into the rhythm and the rhyme, right? You become wrapped in the text, dare I say trapped by the text, right until the very end. So there's some kind of agreement that you make with the reader that this is the rhythm we're going along with, kind of like watching a movie. It's the agreement, it's the contract, unspoken. But you'll notice certain things. There is a determination to name and name and name again, right? There's also kind of, dare we say, lightheartedness towards the end about someone who was taken and captured, right? We'll talk about some of this. Because I want to leave plenty of room for, before I deconstruct any further, because I'm sure I want to leave room for questions. There were a couple of survivors out of this whole mix, so we can come back and talk about that. But to step back, right? let the thing be contained by the thing itself, but also think about context to lend some understanding to the piece itself. A lot of my work stands on the shoulders of Gretchen Gersina Holbrook. So her and her husband spent, I want to say, about a decade years ago, doing some deep dives and research on Lucy Terry Prince, not just Lucy Terry Prince, Lucy and Abijah Prince, and about their lives, and deconstructing, and addressing basically some of the myths that we know that are floating all over the lovely internet. And so what they did is they went, and it was this great treasure hunt. What I love about the book also as well, if you've not read it, it's just the way it brings you in. Like, not all history books do that. Some of them can tend to be a bit dry. This felt very close, like you were also included on the unzipping and the discovery, which I really did enjoy. So Lucy most likely is born circa 1730. In West Africa, somewhere between 1728, if you see right here, 1728 and 1730, she's kidnapped and from West Africa and brought to where's now Rhode Island. 1733, Lucy is eventually enslaved by Reverend Ebenezer and Abigail Wells in Deerfield, Mass. So in historic Deerfield, you still can see where she was enslaved, and as a part of her duties, she also served in their tavern. By 1735, Lucy is recognized as a resident of Deerfield Congregational Church within a period called the Great Awakening. There's so much thick history if you just read Gretchen's book and then think about all the layers of things that were happening all at the same time, much like if you could imagine someone 200 years from now looking at now and looking at all the things happening, right? And Great Awakening was all about the way people were shifting and changing the way their relationship to God and religion, right? By 1747, 1749, here is most likely where she meets her future husband, Abijah Prince. And by 1731, so somehow Abijah he was really good with his negotiating skills, and as we discover, Lucy as well. And their freedom is negotiated. They marry, they start their life. We also have the French and Indian War happening at some point in the background. Not some in the background, but that's the context that's happening. And you have 1746, the birth of Bars Fight. So she is enslaved at the time of penning Bars Fight. I say penning lightly because the poem goes on to survive about 100 years in oral tradition before we ever see it in print, which I think is pretty fascinating. So this is also the second raid in 4 decades on Deerfield, Mass. So there was a first raid about 40 years previous, and then this was the second raid. And then you have 1756, so about a decade later, she starts giving birth because her and Abijah are starting their family. Okay. I think the clicker and I are going to be friends tonight. It will agree with me. Perfect. So we have 1775 where the princes moved to Guilford, Vermont. So some of this stuff is happening before some of the states become official states. So you have that going on too, just the wild nature of the way land is handled. We'll get into that in a little bit. The American Revolutionary War is 1775. So you've got so many things happening, like I've mentioned. By 1782, so you have, again, if you look here in this lower corner right here, more children. So they have a total of 6 children by this time, right? You have Drusilla Prince, Festus Prince, Totney Prince, and Abijah Prince, all their children being born at this time. By 1782, the princes have Joseph Stanton and John Noyes served because they'd been harassing them. And so Stanton has to answer for the assault of their 2 youngest boys. and noise has to answer to the destruction of crops and property. And during this time, Abijah also takes some people to court to argue for things that are owed to him. Some people owe him money, for example, because he would make runs in the way that a lot of people might do, right? When they don't have cars, they don't have Amazon, as we all in this room understand history, right? So he was getting paid to make runs back and forth. Some people didn't pay up. They owed him. He took them to court. Now, by 1785, we have Lucy Terry Prince going to Norwich, Vermont, and argues in the highest court of Vermont at the time. It's the governor and council, as they're known. And she talks about the harassment and the fact that her family needs protection, that they need protection. She wins that. She wins that round. She's able to go back, and they're able to notify the select men, not the select board then, but just the select men, to protect the princes. Well, by 1787, crops in various parts of Vermont fell, right? And the princes included. And so Abijah sells the land. So then we have over here, can I move around with the mic? Am I allowed? Yay! So, and this is also for the benefit of the people who may not be in this room with us. So in 1794, right here, we have Abijah Prince dying, but we also have Lucy going closer to live where her sons are in Sunderland, Vermont. So the one thing I did leave out, while they are in Deerfield, Mass, Abijah is amassing land. He gets land in Guilford, Vermont, and he gets land in Sunderland, Vermont. So he's going back and forth, he's establishing these things. They have this land. The harassment happens in Guilford. Lucy goes to Sunderland. By 1797, their sons Caesar and Festus, they bring a lawsuit against a guy named Eli Brownson due to a series of maneuverings. So remember how I told you that things were just wild in terms of there were no deed, what deed, right? So somehow he got their land in Sunderland. It became a case. By 1803, Lucy adds to this, argues the appeal about the lands in the Vermont Supreme Court and saying, okay, well, that was our land. What are you going to do to reward us? The award is $200 at the time. So she won the case, but then she was like, okay, great. And they didn't get the land back. But then she did say, look, you owe us a place to live. This is from the governor and council. These are the primary sources. So this was a few years ago by this point, even though it feels like it was yesterday, literally. I was involved with a number of different people. Gretchen Gerzina, the author of that lovely book about the princes, also was involved in this effort to establish a historic marker, which there had never been a historic marker in Vermont, and we did it. I think it was the year that was the anniversary of the death of Lucy Terry Prince. She died in 1821. So we established a historic marker, but in order to do that, and I know why they do this, because otherwise it'd be too easy to put up markers about anything. So you have to establish what the young people would call receipts. You have to show the receipts. And being the imp that I am, I'm glad they have that established, because again, otherwise you'd be able to put up markers about anything, right? So we had to establish all the verifiable evidence of, like, this is what she's done, this is what the family did, this is, and fact check everything, in addition to, the state office, them reading the book, gaining an understanding of who she was, who the family was. 2021 marked the 200th anniversary of her death. And so, but there's another thing about Vermont that should be known, and I was a resident of Vermont for just over a decade, and I just relocated to New Hampshire here. So, but the interesting thing about the landscape of Vermont, Dr. Harvey Amani Whitfield wrote a book essay, I should say, called The Problem of Slavery in Early Vermont from 1777 to 1810. Because it is widely understood. People will say, well, it was the first to, take enslavement out of the Constitution. Okay. However, we might want to look a little bit closer than that, which was his point. So in 1777, yes, Vermont becomes the first colony to abolish slavery, but the language is flimsy. Hence the reason why, side note, you want your lawyers to pay close attention, right, to grammar and such. I've heard some horrible situations where if that's not the case, if the language is weak, it doesn't bow too well. So the gaps allowed for the enslavement of children in different ways that African Americans still could be exploited. There was also an ad in the 1786 Vermont Gazette that basically allowed for enslavers to run ads looking for individuals who took their freedom. So it raises a question, well, if they did take that out of the Constitution, why or what was happening in the landscape that still allowed for that, right? Then we have in 1789, there was a debate in the Bennington Friendly Society about whether or not what they would do if they came upon an individual who was seeking help because they took their freedom. And there was a debate. Everybody did not agree with whether or not to help, right? So that's also very telling. 1791, Vermont becomes an official state. And then there's the case of Dinah and Judge Stephen. So Judge Stephen Jacob was a Supreme Court figure in Vermont. And so he was technically breaking the law in terms of having an enslaved person, throws her out in the street when she can no longer perform her duties. When his select men from his town wanted to bring forth receipts and say, hey, we have a bill of sale, we have this, his peers didn't want to hear it, they didn't want to see it. And they're basically, it's not complicated, it's cut and dry. He was enslaving an individual when he wasn't supposed to, when it was supposed to be technically illegal. And the only reason why the selectmen wanted to bring the case is because they wanted reimbursement for having to support Dinah, not for the human rights angle. So also, there were no anti-slavery societies until the 1830s, and something I discovered in all this was that anti-slavery society, they helped to keep African Americans safe. They helped to advocate. So that's just some stuff I just didn't know. To tell you a little bit more specifically about August 25th, 1746. So this raid included 60 Abenaki men under the French commander Vaudreuil. Bars is an old term for meadow. Right, I always make a joke when I'm telling this to young people. It's like, no, this is not a bar fight, not what you think of an actual bar. We're talking about landscape here, right? It was written in the form of a ballad, which we talked about, which was very, very common. And also just when you hear the language, it's easy to memorize and commit it to the body. It survives for 100 years. It survives for 100 years until in 1854, it shows up on the front page of the Springfield Daily Republican. And again, it's really fascinating. Even when you see artists today and they've made tons of work, a whole body of work, like one or two stand out, right? But it's just like, well, how does something stand out? She was known as an orator. She was known as somebody who committed the Bible to memory. She was known as someone to just tell stories, hold court, quite a force, her whole family being quite the force. So that's why we always say the only known poem that we know of. There may have been poems that she spoke that just were not recorded or written down. Also keep in mind, paper is not, even though there have been things happening in the publishing industry where there's paper shortages and issues, but paper back then was really expensive, like one sheet of paper, right? So you didn't have people running around with journals, as we all know in this room. So let's look at the context beyond the individual and start looking at the literary surround, especially as we think about Poetry Month. So the orality piece is very fascinating to me, especially as you start to look at over the years, even in modern times, how we seem to be going back to orality in a certain way. I'll give an example. It may or may not be appropriate, but I've seen people relate this example I'm about to give to the figure of the griot, the West African griot. There's a woman who took to, and I'm not on TikTok, so that's my disclaimer right there, not on TikTok. However, because I've taught media studies, I kind of have to be aware of those things. There was a woman who did a 50-part series. I see a head nod. Yes. Who the F did I marry? Now, I know that just seems like not important or whatever, like what is this, right? But there's something about, if we take it out of even any kind of judgment and just go back to the simplicity of what humans did when there was radio. And then before that, when there was no radio, what did you do with your neighbors? You spilled tea. It's what we called. So you spilled tea. You talked about what's going on. It's a way you stayed aware, right? It's a way you stayed up on things. And the griot was multifunction. In Africa, the griot is the figure who's the historian, the record keeper, holding history right in the body. And there was something also known, field hollows. And the fields, and during enslavement, and spirituals. And so there's this deep among humans to just tell stories, right? And I mentioned that 50-part series because, one, I'm like, who sat there? Who's all sitting there to watch all fit in or listen? And people did. Millions. And it also points to me, I mean, is everybody being nosy? Well, the snarky part of me could say that. But I think another part of me who's way more interested and curious about human trends would say, I think it really speaks to our oral tradition, right? When we get into looking at spoken word. And there's not, I hate the questions around, spoken word or written. There's not a or, it's and, right? And I do think it just links back to, as humans, early societies, what did we do? We told stories, right? So, and I'm going to give you the source material for this. So here's one way of looking at the era, and this is specifically situated not just in American poetry, but also Black American poetry. We're looking at Bury Me in a Freeland era, which is 1770 to 1899, right? Now, Lucy Terry Prince falls shy just outside of it, but I would still put her in that constellation and even bigger constellations. We have Benjamin Banneker, who was an astronomer, a farmer. He has I don't know if I included in this iteration of the presentation, very fun poem about mathematics and measuring, right, through a conversation. So all about freedom, right? What is freedom? What is liberty? As some of the major themes in this work. Lift every voice. Individuals becoming connected, establishing voice, 1900 to 1918. Technically, you could go down each and every and spend really good time in each of these periods. So I just want to bring attention to that fact too. Then we have something called the period of the Dark Tower, so 1919 to 1936. So riots, unrest, all these different things, not just Tulsa. There was one year that was called the Red Summer. Like there were all these racial riots and lots of Black and brown bodies that were in a lot of danger, right? And also art coming out of that as well. There was never not any art coming out of all of this. Ballads of remembering, right? So this is where, within the era, 1936 to 1959, where we have Zora Neale Hurston publishing Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a beautiful, beautiful book if you've not read it. Really amazing. Ideas about ancestry. Again, like if you look at those two eras, the Ballad of Remembrance and also the ideas about ancestry. So going back to put together what I would call maybe was dismembered socially and historically, right? Tapping back into that. So all of this coming out of Kevin Young's work, who is poet extraordinaire, African-American poetry, 250 years of struggle and song. And this was his way of categorizing and breaking down the different eras. You have something called the Blue Light Sutras, the commingling of a self with the range of histories, different voices, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Praise songs for the day. And then the current, some see this as another moment of a Black art renaissance, right? So again, different ways to think about different voice, different witness. I do have some questions that I do usually like to close with, some that I took a little bit of a different angle with this time, to think about witness. Because I think each and every one of us could really ask ourselves a question about how we are bearing witness. Even if your form of bearing witness doesn't turn up until 200 or 300 or 400 years from now, right? Which shows us in this work, also shows us in another work that I just reviewed and blurbed called The Maroons, that just made it into English for the first time in February of this year. It was confiscated, wiped. You probably never even heard of the book. But the book just came out, and it's just like, whoa. And it shines another light on a piece of invisible history. So here we have Angelina Weld Grimke, who's a poet. And here, one of the things I like about this poem, which is very fascinating, and you could argue with the Lucy Terry Prince poem. So, nature writing. Nature poetry. Nature poetry usually can be perceived as being a very specific kind of writing by a very specific kind of voice. So we think of Thoreau, we think of, people of a certain skin inheritance who are able to enjoy outdoors in a certain way. And we then subtract other people from that experience. What I appreciate, though, is when I've taken a closer look at that whole even category of what we would call nature poetry, it takes on a different, very interesting tone. Nature becomes a kind of character, right? So I would invite everybody to even take a look at that, take a different look at what we're calling and what we would say something's nature and who or what is a part of that. So in this specific poem, I've just seen a beautiful thing, slim and still against a gold sky, a straight cypress, sensitive, exquisite, a black finger pointing upwards. Why, beautiful still finger, are you black? And why are you pointing upwards? Again, what's fascinating about that is it commingles the environment with the body with such an intimacy, but also raises a question, right? It brings together not just literal landscape, but kind of the political landscape, right? And also a personal landscape. There are levels to that. This was from a snippet of my interview with Terrence Hayes, a poet and author. We did this back in 2020. And so one of the things I was looking at is how with a group of people where there is a rupturing of memory, does stuff still pop up that's connected to, that go beyond the rupture itself, even if it's not conscious of it. Like, how is stuff handled down? And I was so curious about it. And he said, it is about exploring the poems. If you think about it, Langston Hughes at 18 years old wrote that kind of poem. Negro Speaks of Rivers is what he's referring to. Speaking for all Black people, that is the first time Black people really came into the canon. It is those kinds of questions. What sort of poem that has endured all these years, though he wrote the poem at 18, lived to be 65 years old, wrote thousands of poems. Why is that one his best known? right? And he says that poem is an example of historical longing if you've passed through slavery and figuring out how to maintain some relationship with your history, even if you have to make it up. We're always making our history because we're such orphans in America. Our poetry is really a good example of watching people try to create a sense of history. So thinking about a certain kind of telling and what that means and what that implies, and the way I don't even now remember what question it was I asked him, but he focused in on the one work that made it. And I think I was asking, well, how does current work, how does it become conscious of its lineage, even if it's not conscious of its lineage? Then you have Gwendolyn Brooks. Speech to the young, speech to the progress toward, among them, Nora and Henry III. Say to them, say to the downkeepers, the sun slappers, the self-soilers, the harmony hushers, even if you are not ready for the day, it cannot always be night. You will be right, for that is the hard home run. Live not for battles won, live not for the end of the song, live in the along, right? So, again, when I picked this series of work, and also thinking about the different stories that I'm telling in between, again, it raises one of the internal questions about what are we going to do with this good, juicy, and troubling, yes, time? What are we going to do about it? How are we going to be in conversation with it? How are we going to be, as one of my friends say, very engaged and active with it? And it doesn't always mean that you're going to be the one like right on the front streets holding a sign. You may be the one to say, you know what, I'm sitting here and I see something and it moves me to create in some way. In 1950, the year Gwendolyn Brooks became the first African-American to win the Pulitzer Prize, her editor asked whatever made her write. Brooks answered that she wrote to prove to others by implication, not by shouting, and to such among themselves who have yet to discover it, that they are merely human beings, not exotics. She wrote while scrubbing, washing, ironing, cooking, dropping the mop, broom, soap, iron, or carrot grater to write down a line or a word. Writing, she said, is the only work in which I'm interested. And what I like about her answer is interesting because I'm about to give a keynote in a few days. I'm no longer capable of telling people about a creative life that somehow includes a pristine studio and time. Somehow time that people would like to assume that people have who create. It just doesn't really always work that way. Sometimes you're maybe creating while you're driving, or I've known people to be creating while they're burping the baby, or I've known people to be creating while they're sitting with someone who's dying. So life is happening, and the creating is happening right inside and beside of it, not a separate thing, at least for my experience. Remember I mentioned earlier about the poetry, the era that got into the use and an engagement with different voices and different histories. So I spelled A-I, capital A, lowercase I, not to be confused with AI, poet from 1947 to 2010. She's interesting. She's actually among my favorite for what she does with the dramatic dialogue. And she becomes every and anybody. And it's chilling. Anybody in here ever read Aya's work? Oh, you're in for a surprise if you pick up her collection. And I will read this to you because it's just, how much time do I have? Do I still have some time? Yeah. For questions? Okay, great. So I'll go through this, and this is I probably should have chosen a shorter one. She embodied, to give you some insights into how she rolls, she will embody everybody from the perceived monster to the perceived hero and everybody in between. So this one's called The Good Shepherd. I lift the boy's body from the trunk, set it down, then push it over the embankment with my foot. I watch it roll down into the river and feel I am rolling with it. Feel the first cold slap of the water, wheeze and fall down on one knee. So tired, so cold. Lord, I need a new coat. Not polyester, but wool, new and pure like the little lamb I killed tonight. With my right hand, that same hand that hits with such force, I push myself up gently. I know what I'd like, some hot cocoa by the heater. Once home, I stand at the kitchen sink, letting the water run until it overflows the pot. Then I remember the blood in the bathroom, and so upstairs I take cleanser to begin to scrub the tub, the tiles, toilet bowl, then the bathroom, mop, vacuum, and dust bag. Work and work for the joy of it, for the black boys who know too much but not enough to stay away, and sometimes a girl, the girls too, how their hands grab at my ankles, my knees, and don't need to lead them like a good little shepherd. I stand at the sink, where the water is still overflowing the pot. Turn off the faucets. Then heat the water and sit down. It's the last sweet mouthful of chocolate. Burns its way down my throat. I open the library book, the one on mythology, and begin to read. Saturn, it says, devours his children. Yes, it's true, I know it. An ordinary man, though a man like me, eats and is full. Only God is never satisfied. Her disturbing is just like maybe the lightest word to use, right? Some people may like cringe and some may actually go towards it. Again, I enjoy that she is never her different persona. She's never just one person on the page, but she becomes so many selves. And this is a quote, I was a believer in the old-fashioned sense of good and evil, and this seems to have directed the unmitigated passion in her poems. One only has to look at the titles of her 8 collections to glimpse into the moral questions of Aya's work. Cruelty, killing floor, sin, fate, greed, vice, new and selected poems, dead, and no surrender. Some of her poems, at times, excerpted passages or facsimils gleaned from the book of Revelation. Hidden in the praises are the curse in the mouths of seers, soothsayers, and shape-shifting prophets, posing as everyday citizens. She also gives us the voices of J. Edgar Hoover, James Dean, Jack Ruby, Lenny Bruce, General George Armstrong Custer, Jimmy Hoffa, Walt Whitman, Richard Nixon, Joe McCarthy, and the Good Shepherd. Some of the voices let us in on the secretive thoughts on moments that betray the speaker and listener, reader. I guess I also enjoy work that will stretch you way beyond what's comfortable, because those words, her words, they're not comfortable, they're not safe. Rita Dove's Hade's Pitch. This is from her collection Mother Love, in which she has an engagement with Greek mythology, right? Persephone's kidnapping, well, not just kidnapping, what would be called rape. If I could just touch your ankle, he whispers, there on the inside, above the bone, leans closer. Breath of lime and pepper, I know I could make love to you. She considers, this secretly thrilled, though she wasn't quite sure what he meant. He was good with words, words that went straight to the liver. Was she falling for him out of sheer boredom? Cooped up in this anything but humble dive, stone, gargoyles leering, the brocade drapes licked fire. Her ankle burns, or he described it. She sighs, just as her mother above ground stumbles, is caught by the fetlock, bereft in an instant. while the great man drives home his desire. I'm ending with this before I get to my questions. You know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for the house and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use, but this is in fact not flooding. It is remembering. Remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. Writers are like that. I would also say artists, just in general, and maybe just the human collective. Remembering where we were, that valley we ran through, what banks were like, the light that was there, and the route back to our original place. It is an emotional memory, what the nerves and the skin remember, as well as how it appeared, and a rush of imagination is our flooding, and that is Toni Morrison. So as we open up for questions, and as I leave you with some of my own questions, thinking about going beyond the possibility of Lucy Terry Prince and what she poses. There's so many things about the Prince family in terms of, African-American land ownership, and learning about that aspect of things, learning about enslavement in New England, because yes, New England participated in enslavement. But also thinking about work that bears witness and thinking about the watchers of the work. I had one poet ask me, would this poem have been different depending on what she heard and did not hear of the white residents in Deerfield talking about the raid? How would that change how she would have written it, and how would that have changed how we see it? How is voice constructed and impacted by such a thing, which I'm co-editing an anthology on voice. How do we think about voice? Written voice and voice that's only spoken. And do we bound something to time or look at ways that it becomes timeless? How it still asks credible questions that we still need to tangle with today. So I will close with that, and I would love to open with questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Is there other work that is thought to be by Lucy Terry Prince?
That's a very complicated question, because like I said, the only known that we know of is Barr's fight. I think that maybe there's something waiting to be discovered, so we hope, right, that would make itself known. But that's all we have for now. But thank you for that question. It's a really important one.
Was her husband also originally from Africa, or was he from here?
I will have to look at that again and get you back an answer for that. Maybe that's possibly a yes, but I want to look at that because when I was reading the book, of course, I was hyper-focused on, I was so taken by Lucy's story. I didn't ignore Abijah, never ignore Abijah, but I didn't hone in as finely on his details, but I'll circle back on that question. Any other questions? I think it's, again, one of the things to encourage everybody to think about is how do we think of this moment, right? Like this very filled moment, and what does bearing witness look like? It doesn't necessarily, just because I write or camera are my tools, doesn't mean, or journalism for that matter, all my different tools, doesn't necessarily mean those are the tools, obviously, that you all know that you will use. It's the question of, even in our telling, even in our own orality, even in things that appear and then disappear and become ethereal, what does that do with this moment? And then how is what we're creating and engaging with going beyond because I'm always fascinated by that as well, something that is timeless. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a book that I got a chance to review before it came out. I think it was discovered again in the 1970s, but I want to say 180 years ago. It was confiscated, and the French viewed it as a disruption to order when it was confiscated. The Maroons is what the book is called. And it's right off of an island, one of the, considered the first writings off of an island near of Madagascar, and focuses on enslavement in the Indian Ocean area, which again, shining a light on a piece of history that we don't necessarily talk about. And one of the questions that that book asks, that the Maroons ask, is, what is the price of freedom? Would you risk your own to then make sure and ensure others have a quality of life and are free? And the chilling last words of the book, and how it carries forth even now, and like I said, just appeared in English for the first time in February of this year. So I'm just really fascinated. So I think with some of the questions, I think that there's more that I think as we peel, it's like peeling back the onion layers. There are more layers to be discovered about so many things that we don't know. Any other questions?
It just occurs to me that we have to assume that one of the issues with finding her work may be that she did not read or write. That the reason that this was an oral tradition was that she wrote it in her mind. She sang it or she said it. She passed it on to the people around her, and it became something that became historical fact. But it may well be that in all of that time, with going to the courts and everything else, we would have to find evidence that she could write in order to be able to find the rest of her work.
Well, no, she was highly literate. And you can see, like, the fact that she had memorized the pieces or, like, large, like, the Bible, and was able to, like, say it back in a way that I know I can't. Like, her memorization and her ability, right? Which I would think Socrates once made the argument, is it in Plato's Republic, where he says, or warns, when things, or there's a debate about when things go into print, basically we're screwed, because like that ability to remember it and hold it is going to go. And so Lucy is within that ability to be able to do that, but she is high literacy. The question is, one of the problems could be, like, again, paper was very expensive, sure, right? Also, if you're an enslaved person and you have tasks, or if you're a homesteader, because she became freed and she had a family, doesn't necessarily mean that she had time to, right? Like, sit and write, because, like, the cost of paper, in addition to rearing children and having a homestead. And then, as you mentioned, the court, she fought a couple of court cases. So I think it more has to do with those pieces. And again, the expensive quality of the paper, having access to it. But she was highly, highly literate. And one of the things that becomes known out of Gretchen's research is the nature of enslavement in the Northeast. So here in the North, can't make a false dichotomy and say that things were better at all. But enslaved people were allowed to read, they were allowed to write. They also sometimes would bear arms going across, whether they were formal states, but going across territory lines on behalf of their enslavers. So still to benefit the enslavers. So the bigger context is to know that individuals were taught, like we have Phyllis Wheatley, right? Who, her book comes out when I think Lucy might be around the age of 40-something years old, and will have penned Barr's Fight. And then there's Phyllis Wheatley's first, the first African-American book with full book that we know of. And I keep saying that we know of because who knows what's yet to be discovered. But at least in the North, teaching enslaved people skills for the benefit of the enslavers was the thing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions? Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Of course, thank you. Thank you.
And if people could fill out the audience surveys and turn them in as you leave, we would really appreciate that. Thank you.